If we are asked to name the first American community between the Atlantic Ocean and the western reach of the Appalachian Mountains, we might think our safest bet is St. Augustine, Florida, which, after all, the Spanish founded in 1565. That is where written records take us, and at least technically, anything before written records isn't even history. But that is a debate best suited for those who enjoy debating. The actual story of human activity extends well before 5,000 years ago, when, according to some sources, written language came into being. How far before that do we need to go? Well, archaeologist offers the answer. Our species arrived 3 million years ago, which means about 99.83% of human activity occurred before the first words were ever recorded. So, if we are asked about the first East Coast community, we must dramatically recalibrate our thinking. And there is a modest location in a highly understated part of central Pennsylvania which can help us do so. At the start of the War of 1812, sometimes called America's Second War of Independence from Britain, members of the Pennsylvania state government recalled with some discomfort how vulnerable Philadelphia proved to be during our Revolutionary War. After all, the British were able to sail up the Delaware Bay and the Delaware River and capture Philadelphia on September 26, 1777. Now, heeding the proverb, "Fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me," the state government was moved from very accessible Philadelphia to the very inaccessible seat of Dauphin County, Harrisburg on the Susquehanna River, just about the time the Second War was getting underway. The potential menace of a second Redcoat invasion gave Dauphin County a prominence it could never have imagined since its creation in 1785. For this reason, county dwellers are understandably inclined to suppose that the first residents here had something to do with John Harris, who became a licensed trader in 1705 and owner of the river's ferry service 20 years later. That perfectly reasonable supposition is, however, off by a few years, about 11,300 years to be a bit more precise. And the first seasonal community was not in today's Harrisburg area, but about 16¼ straight line miles to the northeast. The data for this mini doc video is just a minuscule part of the comprehensive information provided by a publication entitled The First Pennsylvanians by Drs. Kurt Carr and Roger Miller, and available through the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Unless otherwise indicated, the visuals were photographed at the Pennsylvania State, sometimes called the William Penn Museum in Harrisburg. Although I am proud to be an associate member of the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation, and I'm not above tooting my own horn, the attribution is provided free of charge on my part because I am grateful to be even a very small part of such a remarkable organization. The location of the very first residence, however seasonal, of the first East Coasters can only be approximated here because the actual site is an understandably closely guarded secret by our state's archaeologists. The last thing that they, and for that matter the owners, would ever want is to have artifacts hobbyists or callous vandals tearing through the grounds in hope of acquiring relics that, for the most part, were removed a very long time ago. In any case, the location is in a region south of Berry Mountain, indicated by the northern or upper red line of the map, and Pennsylvania State Route 225, between the borough of Elizabethville in Likens Valley and the village of Fisherville in the Jackson Township reach of Armstrong Creek Valley. More specifically, it includes Dividing Ridge, designated by the southern or lower line. Regarding its bona fides, the site is officially designated 36DA20 by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and is also known as the Shute Site, acknowledging the Shute family who owned the land at the time of the excavation. As mentioned, it is located on Dividing Ridge in Dauphin County, east of Pennsylvania State Route 4004, southeast of the village of Enders in the Jackson Township reach of Armstrong Creek Valley. It is also northeast of the village of Enterline in the Wayne Township reach of Powell's Creek Valley, 2.5 straight line miles southwest of the borough of Elizabethville. It was excavated and analyzed in 1952 under the leadership of Dr. John Whithoff, the Pennsylvania state archaeologist. It is especially prominent because it is the second oldest Pennsylvania archaeological site after the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, designated 36WH297. The Shute site is also one of the oldest in the entire United States. But the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is in the Allegheny Mountains, and therefore the oldest East Coast community would be the Shute site. At the time of the excavation, hunting for Native American artifacts, particularly in the form of arrowheads and fragments of pottery, was very much in vogue, and relic hunters could be found traversing newly plowed fields to see what might have been brought to the surface as farmers prepared for spring planting. Although in theory, arrowheads could be found on forest floors and along nature trails, the combined actions of gravity and soil layers replenished by decayed leaves and accompanying breezes meant that archaeological specimens were usually covered by several inches of topsoil. Discovering arrowheads has always been a fairly rare occurrence, and even a single find could be quite gratifying. For this reason, the uncovering of what they supposed to be arrowheads was a thrilling occurrence when these relics were found in the early 1950s. And that thrill only grew at the site as the number of specimens grew, from a few to a few dozens. Yet there was something different about these so-called arrowheads, aside from their quantity. Veteran collectors, including experienced hobbyists, knew that typical arrow points averaged about 1 inch to 1.5 inches in length, and often about 3/4 of an inch in width. Many times, blades longer than 1 inch were proportionately thinner. And these items were something else altogether. A prominent, yet fairly typical specimen was 2¼ inches long and 1 inch in width. It also contained a prominent fluke or channel to which a wooden shank or neck would obviously be attached. The fluke measured 3/4 of an inch in length 3/8 of an inch in width, and its depth varied from 0 at the point end to 3/16 of an inch from the shaft end. These weren't arrowheads at all. They were blade points for spears. And the composition of the points immediately caught the archaeologist's attention. Although often called flint, to which it is related, the mineral used by Native Americans to make blade heads is actually called chert, which is easier to work. This particular form of chert differed markedly from the types one finds in this part of Pennsylvania. Chert is chemically silicon dioxide, but contains other compounds as well. In this case, the presence of calcium and magnesium provided clear signs of its place of origin. In fact, it was Onondaga chert, which comes from several hundred miles away in modern New York State. And most astoundingly of all, studies including a careful analysis of soil composition would reveal that it arrived here at least 12,500 years ago. Now, these blade points, whose numbers would eventually exceed 400, were not the only evidence that prehistoric cultures had spent time on Dividing Ridge. Fragments of other tools indicated the Shoup Indians had done more than simply rested their feet here. It wasn't long before acceptance of the site's prominence became coupled with an obvious question. If ancient people, officially known as Paleo-Indians, were determined to travel 170 airline miles, much farther when we consider that they couldn't travel in a straight line, and especially when their only form of transportation was the Mukluk and Moccasin Express, they must have had a good reason. What was it? And the answer? Caribou. They're not just any caribou, the kind that roamed freely through Ice Age North America and grew in size with the same lack of restraint. They could weigh in at more than 1,400 pounds. These herd animals were also movers. They migrated along routes that included Armstrong and Powell's valleys. And the Shoup population, which was necessarily small, also necessarily moved with it. Fortunately for the hunters, the herds apparently found good grazing land on both sides of Dividing Ridge, and they stayed long enough to make equally good use of it. This gave the partially to semi-nomadic trackers the chance to rest and refit, and the Shoup site became vital in this process. And this was something of a hunter's paradise. That is, if one could overlook the decided inconveniences of crude heating in hide-thin shelters and make your own sportswear. But there was a lot of game and relatively few Nimrods, and the prey was not particularly aware that the two-legged animals weren't there simply to enjoy the scenery. Given a choice, caribou preferred flight to fight, and generally this was the better choice. If the quadrupeds bothered to consider their losses to human predation, and personally I doubt it, they might have viewed it the way 19th century field commanders viewed light losses in battle, regrettable but accepted. Yet this was not a sport, and by no means a pursuit for the poorly prepared. To be sure, a great deal of technical expertise, not only as hunters, but as skilled craftsmen, was required for success. It may be hard to imagine, but the Shoup site hunters lived so long ago that bows and arrows weren't in use. If only because during this time, the type of wood needed for bows such as sycamore, hickory, and beechwood, were not adapted to this tundra-type environment. At first, hand-thrown spears would have been sufficient for prey that didn't view you as particularly dangerous if you weren't chasing. But as caribou and their kin caught on to the biped strategy, the latter adjusted as well. Hunting spears consisted of three parts: the fluted blade point, described earlier, the neck, a skillfully carved length of wood which securely held the blade point, and the shaft, which transmitted the force needed to pierce the prey. In time, the hunters acquired a field knowledge of physics, transforming linear leverage into increased velocity and subsequently greater stopping power. The launcher, called the atlatl, gained greater punch through lithics, placing a drilled stone on the launch and increasing the force. Paleo hunters would gladly have left the finer calculations to Sir Isaac Newton. What mattered is that the atlatl got results. The Pennsylvania hunters of today certainly value conservation, and rightly so. 12.5 millennia ago, however, the only extinction paleo people justly cared about was their own. Hunting was not a sport or a diversion. It was the most basic of necessities, especially in a climate where gathering food was difficult and often inadequate. And hunting was not just required to provide fuel to keep folks going. It was needed to keep the energy released through digestion from escaping through naked skin. Fortunately for the first East Coasters, their own ancestors made vital discoveries long before these descendants arrived at what became Pedd's Woods. In fact, long before they crossed what was then the Beringia land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska, their ancestors had learned how to cope with a climate that threatened their very survival. Simply put, they observed the advantage that their fellow mammals enjoyed in dealing with gelid temperatures and quite literally seized it for themselves. If a thick hide and even thicker fur kept the four-leggeds warm, these could do the same for the Paleo Indians. Once they were removed from their original owners, or perhaps more accurately, their original owners were removed from them. In this image from a state museum diorama, we see a hunter returning from a hunt with the results of a one-on-one stalking event, dressed in what would most likely be caribou hide. It is obviously where the fur side of the hide would do the hunter most good, right next to his bare skin. The second image from the diorama indicates something notable. Aside from the impressive size of the caribou being divested of its hide and flesh, the presence of animals capable of providing ivory. We'll return to this matter soon, but we should first note that the landscape, such as can be detected through the blue and implicitly cold light, that characteristic of the climate which typified and even succeeded the Pleistocene era, aka the Ice Ages. The region still experienced warmer months, but they were never warm enough to melt all the snow from the preceding winter. The third image indicates that shelters were light and portable, although despite their makeshift appearance, they were both portable and capable of providing vital protection from the cold. This shelter is the prototype of what will become the wigwam design, a dome-shaped structure of tree boughs in the shape of inverted U's and covered first with hide, and then in later periods with tree bark, especially as hunter-gatherers gradually became farmers and dwellings would become semi-permanent. The time of the archaic Indians was about to begin. Now, what about that evidence of tusk ivory? On July 5, 1968, a peat mine owner-operator named John Leet discovered massive bones on his property in Monroe County near Marshalls Creek, Pennsylvania. This skeletal evidence indicated that during the time of the Paleo-Indians, they scared the landscape with some pretty fair-sized neighbors, including the woolly mastodon, a relatively speaking smaller cousin of the woolly mammoth. Bagging such game was a super benefit for the first Pennsylvanians, probably including the original East Coasters, because the food and clothing provided by one such creature equaled the products of several caribou. The vital stats for the Marshalls Creek mastodon leave no doubt as to how formidable the creature really was. It stood 9 feet at the shoulder, nearly 14 feet from tail to tusk root, almost 18.5 feet from tail to tusk tip, and 19.5 feet if you measure from tail to trunk tip. It could raise its tusks to a height of 14 feet and deliver a devastating blow with its 5-ton, 10,000-pound body. An interesting footnote is that even so, it was only 3/4 the size of the typical woolly mammoth, which once dominated the northern regions of Europe, Asia, and North America. Remarkably, despite the size and power of these behemoths, they faced a decided disadvantage in dealing with paleo huntsmen. According to archaeologists and paleozoologists, these ancient members of the elephant family were ill-suited to defend themselves against a determined party of bipedal ambushers who could duck and dodge their prey's lethal but awkward aims. These mighty mammals were also critically slow to reproduce, and so while changing climate posed the greatest nemesis to many ancient mammals, human beings, including the first East Coasters, are thought by many to have been the principal cause for the disappearance of the magnificent mammoths and mastodons. That is quite a distinction, however dubious. And yet, the first East Coasters are notable for another reason. They never really died out, even as their geologic times, the Ice Ages, did. Instead, they provided a starting point when dividing ridge, which their descendants traveled to its southwestern terminus and onto what is now Clemson Island, due west of today's borough of Halifax, Pennsylvania. There they would provide artifacts and evidence for thousands of years and at least 3 more cultural periods.